So for this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about symbolic interaction, right? The paradigm that we're going to probably spend the greatest amount of time focusing on in social psychology. Um, Symbolic interaction is a sociological perspective. Um, it emphasizes how people interpret, act toward, and give meaning to objects, events, and situations around them. So the focus is on interaction, right? The action that occurs between people. And the medium through which that interaction occurs is a medium of symbols, right? Which are things that have shared meaning for two or more people, right? So a symbol is a thing that has shared meaning for two or more people. That is the mechanism through which we coordinate and organize our behavior and thus interact. Ergo, symbolic interactionism. Pretty simple. So, symbolic interactions deeply informed. It's a sociological or social psychological approach, but it's deeply informed by a broader set of underlying philosophical principles, which are really important to people like Mead in the early years of the formation of this particular paradigm. And most especially, maybe the single largest piece of that is this concept called pragmatism. Pragmatism is a theoretical perspective in philosophy, right? So now we're outside of the boundaries of sociology, but this is going to get incorporated in. So it's a theoretical perspective in philosophy which proposes that the meaning of objects, the meaning of concepts and propositions reside in their consequences for our experiences and for our practices. So it's a very fancy way of saying that meaning doesn't reside in a thing, like a gesture or a word. That meaning is a thing that is carried into an experience with that thing, with that gesture or with that word or whatever. So again, this is a kind of a nice go-to example, right? We can talk about a wave. A wave, that's just the name that we apply to this gesture, right? This gesture, if you wanted to describe it, you would say a hand moving laterally at the end of an extended and upraised arm, right? That's kind of a clinical, dissection of this. When you say, what is this? If somebody says a wave, that's not really what it is. It's just the label that we apply to it. What it is a hand moving laterally at the end of an extended and upraised arm. So what does it mean? Well, it means a lot of different things. If people are coming together, it means hello. If people are leaving, that exact same gesture can mean goodbye. If everybody's already together but they're not yet ready to leave, this gesture can be, hey, pay attention. I'm trying to get you to focus up here, right? So this thing doesn't have any inherent meaning at all. The meaning or meanings that it has are things that we bring to that um, um, to that object. This is a very different kind of philosophy than say something like Plato, who would say like there's an essence to everything. There's a core truth to what a thing is, um, um, and so this pragmatism, which is a specifically and uniquely American philosophical tradition, right? So, some of these other philosophies have their origins, in European thought and in other places outside of the United States. But pragmatism, which is things mean what we all agree they mean, that kind of emerges in the United States. It's a 19th century American approach, so 1800s, and it grows out of the work of three key philosophers, and you don't really need to know who they are or what they did. Again, this is not really a psychology or a philosophy class. I want you guys to have a basic understanding of where some of this stuff comes from, but we're not going to dive really deep into it. But Charles Peirce, that's Peirce, not Pierce. It's a weird sort of spelling. But Charles Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. These are three really important American philosophers. The work from all three of these guys gives shape or gives rise to this particular philosophical tradition called pragmatism. And pragmatism is at the core of a symbolic interactionist approach, of a sociological social psychological approach to understanding the social world, right? And where that social world emerges and how that social world emerges from the behavior of people within that society. So that's kind of the umbrella of symbolic interaction. Symbolic interactionists have views, perspectives on a number of key features of society, and I'm going to focus on 4 of them because I think you can kind of see the essence of symbolic interaction represented or illustrated in how they look at these things in the world around us. So, for example, the nature of reality, right? So, symbolic interactionism, when they look at reality, when they try to discern its nature, they would argue that reality is not a thing that is fixed. And by fixed, I don't mean it was broken and it got repaired. I mean fixed in the sense that it's stuck. It's got some permanence to it. So that reality is not fixed and just kind of waiting to be discovered, which is kind of a cornerstone of how science, especially the physical sciences, have kind of approached the world as a kind of thing that's out there and it's unchanging and it's permanent and we just have to discover it. And so in the social sciences, a lot of people took, some of the assumptions from the physical sciences and started applying them in the social sciences and said, hey, society or people or the mind or whatever, that's just a thing that exists independent of human beings, and we just have to go out there and discover it. And symbolic interactionism kind of rejects that, right? Their point is that society specifically, but reality in general, right, which is our understanding of and our sense of the world around us, that is constantly changing. Right? Reality is not fixed. It's dynamic. It's shifting. It's always changing. That isn't to say that we change the material nature of the world around us. The material nature of the world around us, I'm going to just stipulate, is probably relatively uninterested in what we think about it. But our understanding of that reality is very much a product of the tools that we've been given to understand that reality. And we'll see this illustrated again and again and again in a concept that we call the social construction of reality. And it's a thing that sometimes is kind of hard for students to wrap their heads around. But, by the end of the semester, my guess is that this will be something that you're more comfortable with, at least in terms of understanding, if not, fully embracing. Symbolic interaction also has something to say about us as people who know that world, what we would call human knowers. We aren't spectators. We're not objective, sort of separate from and just observing the world around us. We are constantly involved in a process of doing and making that shapes the world. So we don't just move through it. Our activities and actions are also shaping it. And so it's a dynamic view, not just of reality, but also of the participants in kind of creating that reality. Where does this leave us with things like facts or truth or values or action, right? Those are kind of maybe the next inevitable questions, right? If reality is constantly changing and if we are actively engaged in changing and being changed by the nature of that reality, then where's the foundation? How can we say anything is factual? How can we say anything is truth? And it becomes, as you can imagine, a sort of contingent sort of truth, a contingent set of facts. Facts are things that are true, but in society, a thing that is true can be true in a particular moment, but not true at some other point in time, right? So when we want to verify facts and truth, we want to make sure that we're putting those facts and that truth in the context in which people are experiencing it and creating it and being shaped by it. So we want to evaluate people's values, because values are going to shape their understanding of the nature of the world around them. The language that they use is going to shape the nature of the world as they understand it, right? So we want to keep that in mind, is that truth doesn't exist as some unchanging, permanent, universal thing, but rather is contingent and evolves and changes and transforms over time, as the reality that those things exist in is altered and changed over time. And then finally, symbolic interaction has a lot to say about what we would call the progressive role of science. Now, this is one of those places where you can see a real significant divergence between the way that the physical sciences and even some of the social sciences in the 20th century approached the field or the pursuit or the endeavor of science. That for a long time, even into the late 1800s, there were people who were arguing that science must be objective, science must be dispassionate, science can't afford to allow bias or perspective to kind of creep into the picture. We have to be value free. Well, going all the way back to somebody like Max Weber, German sociologist at the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s, or before that, somebody like Marx, who's not strictly speaking a sociologist, although he was very much doing sociology. He's more of an economist, philosopher type, but his work as well was certainly not disconnected from an underlying set of values. It's only in the 20th century that we really see this concerted effort to take the social sciences and turn them into something like, this dispassionate and disconnected set of observers who are merely just describing the world as they find it. We can't be value free. Weber made this point, and others have made it many, many times since then. Science can't be value free, even the physical sciences. The very fact that we decide to study A instead of B, right? We've already introduced bias into the process. We've already, let our judgment shape the approach that we're taking to making sense of the world by saying that A is more important than B because this is what I'm going to focus on studying. So instead of pretending like we're somehow objective, that we're somehow disconnected from the thing that we're trying to understand, what we really ought to do is acknowledge that we have biases so that people can kind of take those into consideration as we share the results of our research. But also, especially in the social sciences, and this is really true of things like sociology or anthropology, maybe political science or economics. I think that if we acknowledge, we being sociologists and social psychologists, both professional and amateur, if we acknowledge that the world that we live in is one that is kind of socially and collectively constructed by all of us, and if we can acknowledge that that world works really well for some people, but maybe not so well for other people, then it's kind of incumbent on us to discuss and promote ways that we could construct it better, right? It isn't enough to just say, this is the nature of the world, go out and do with that information what you will, right? We have a greater responsibility, which is to engage in behaviors, engage in projects that actively promote public good, right? And that that opens the sciences, especially the social sciences, opens them up to potential accusations of subjectivity and of bias. But again, the argument is that bias is always there, right? We've only sort of pretended like it's not. We've only tried to sort of dress up science to make it look like it's value-free and that it's neutral and that it's just a, observing on the sidelines. This is a sort of not unrelated. It's a kind of tangentially related thing. I'm often struck by the way in which, for example, conversations about the Supreme Court in the United States are organized around the idea that the court shouldn't be political, that the Supreme Court justices should just call balls and strikes, and um, um, they should not get engaged. Again, these are political appointees who are appointed specifically because they're going to promote particular political interpretations of the meaning of law, right? If law were so cut and dry and unambiguously, sort of interpreted, we wouldn't need Supreme Court justices. But because you can, in essence, interpret the meaning of what a particular law says or what a particular law was intended to accomplish, you need to bring in arbiters. You need to bring in judges who will make those determinations. And those judges proceed from a set of prior existing assumptions, right? Conservative judges will read the law differently than liberal judges. Reactionary judges will read the law differently than progressive judges, right? And the court is inherently political. It's political in its decision making. It's political in that the consequences of their decisions, which are not normally, unanimous, right? Usually the courts are split and you get a 6-3 or a 5-4 decision from the US Supreme Court. And even though it was 5-4, not a majority, or a majority, but not a unanimous decision, we go with what the majority says. So the court is political, and people like to try to pretend like it's not, but that doesn't change the fact that it is. And we are biased, and science likes to sometimes pretend like it's not, but it very much is. And so symbolic interactionism, to its credit, sort of embraces this and says, all right, so given that we're not passive bystanders, but we're actively involved in this, as well as, sort of engage in a process of observing and describing and explaining it, how can we offer our perspective in a way that leads to the creation of a better and more just society? There's a famous American historian wrote a book called The People's History of the United States, a guy named Howard Zinn. And if you guys have not read A People's History of the United States, I cannot recommend it enough, because history is a construct, right? History isn't the past. There's sometimes a desire to sort of treat those two things as synonymous, but history is a story that we tell about the past. The past is just all the stuff that happened, but most of the stuff that happened doesn't get brought into the present, right? We get a story, we get a distillation of the events that occurred in the past. So, for example, some things are considered to be important enough to be written down in the textbooks or in the narratives or in the monographs. Other things aren't, right? So the history is never a recreation of the past. It's a story about the past. You'll often hear the term revisionist history, but all history is a revision, right? It's a version of the things that came before. So Howard Zinn's revisionist history, or his version of American history, is one that includes a lot of the voices and perspectives that get left out of, say, for example, say a typical high school history textbook. Case in point, right? I studied in my American history class, I studied the Alamo. And I remember, Sam Bowie, Davy Crockett, right? These heroes of the Alamo. And I remember the famous "Remember the Alamo," which was the rallying cry after the Mexican army defeated the people who were under siege in the Alamo. It's a little mission in San Antonio in the war for Texas independence. Texas used to be a state in Mexico, and in 1835 they declared their independence, and Mexico didn't want to let them go, right? It was like the Civil War, right? The American government didn't want to let Virginia and Georgia and the Carolinas and Alabama and Mississippi leave the United States, leave the Union. So we fought a war. Well, the same thing happened in 1835 when Texas seceded from the nation of Mexico. And the Mexican army fought against the revolutionaries, and they lost. Texas became an independent country in 1835, and 10 years later joined the United States. It was annexed by the United States and became part of the USA. When I was a high school student, I had no idea what the Alamo was being fought about, right? I just knew some of the details of the fight. It turns out that the defenders at the Alamo, these brave American heroes, were fighting because Mexico had abolished slavery and they didn't want to give up their slaves. So the people fighting at the Alamo were actually fighting to keep human beings as property. And that kind of changes the story a little bit, right? Makes the people at the Alamo kind of the bad guys. And the Mexicans were the heroes. They were the people fighting for a more just and equitable society in which people wouldn't be kept as human property anymore. So the version of history that we learn in school is just that. It's a version of the past, right? And some of the stuff gets left out, some of the stuff gets left in. Well, Howard Zinn wrote a book called A People's History of the United States that was more inclusive of some of those perspectives that had not been included in, say, most traditional textbooks. And he has a very famous sort of saying in which he says, you can't be neutral on a moving train. In other words, you can't stand still on a train and pretend like you're not moving, right? The train is still moving. So we are all participants in a project, right, which we call society. And the things that society does, that are arguably bad, that we wouldn't want society to do, if we simply stay neutral, we are in fact allowing that practice to continue. So this pretense of neutrality, by saying I'm not going to pick a side, by not picking a side, you've made a choice. You've made a decision to say that the status quo can continue. If other people manage to transform it, good luck to them, but I'm going to be on the sidelines. Well, you're never on the sidelines. Everything is in the game. So that's what I'm talking about, right? That science has a very progressive role to play in society because, like it or not, believe it or not, we are, as scientists, social scientists, but as scientists, we are engaged in this just as much as everybody else is, right? We don't exist in a place independent of and apart from society. We're very much in it. And so there's a role to play that is progressive in nature for people who know how society works and for people who can imagine the ways in which society could work better. It's kind of incumbent on them to do that. So that's what symbolic interactionism has to say about the nature of being on the sidelines versus being involved. There are, and this will wrap us up for this lecture, but there are three premises, right? So three kind of underlying truths, if you will, about the world through a lens of symbolic interactionism. And this was something that again, this guy Bloomer establishes in his book, 1937, Symbolic Interaction. Bloomer says the first premise of symbolic interaction is that people actively define things in their environment, right? So again, as we've mentioned, things don't have an inherent or unchanging meaning, that meanings differ depending on how we define and respond to those things. So, right, that's an active process. So people actively define things in their environment. That's the first premise of symbolic interaction. The second is that meanings arise socially, right? So that when we have a thing that has meaning, that meaning comes from us. And it's shared among us through this process of interaction, right? So the meaning of a thing arises as we experience it, we make sense of it, and we share our understanding of it with others. And then the third premise, and it's kind of obviously going to be connected, which is that people change and modify the interpretation of those objects. And an object can be a lot of things. It can be a gesture, it can be a word, it can be an expression, it can be a person, it can be a structure, a physical structure, it can be a social structure, right? So objects are just, these broad category of things that we can apply names to and attach meanings to. So the meaning of those objects is something that can change, right? Meaning isn't fixed, so we can change the meaning of something over time. We can take something that means something in one context and do that same thing in a different context, and that thing could take on an entirely different meaning. We can have something like think of language, right? It's like dialing a phone. Nobody dials anything anymore. We have keypads, or even keypads are becoming incredibly rare. We have smartphones where the screens are sensitive to heat and touch. But nobody says, I'm going to touch a number, right? We say, I'm going to dial a number. When we hear advertising, dial 1-800. Well, again, we all know that doesn't literally mean dial. We've just taken something that used to have a more literal meaning. When you had rotary dial phones, people would have to dial numbers. We all understand that the word we use, dialing, is less literal and more figurative, but it still means the same thing, which is to do the thing necessary to make a telephone connection between parties. So meanings change over time. Even if the form of the object itself doesn't, right? The word can stay the same, but the meaning can shift over time. But this is really important to remember. That's not an individual level phenomenon. I can't change meaning. We collectively can change meaning, because meaning is a thing that arises collectively. A symbol can't mean something to one person, right? That's definitionally not a symbol. A symbol has to have shared meaning for at least two people. So kind of keep that in mind, right? So symbolic interactionism says, that people actively define the things in their environment, that meanings are going to arise socially, and that those meanings can be changed and modified, right? The interpretation of objects can change over time. And that should, again, give you a little bit of an introduction to symbolic interaction, which we'll come back to um, multiple times in multiple sort of ways over the remainder of the semester. All right, so until next time, have a good one.